In the old city of Damascus, you climb to the hump of a tall, fleet dromedary. With guides and guards about you, you ride through the covered bazaars, crowded with dark-faced Arabs in strange costumes, and along the narrow winding lane which was once called the Street Called Straight. Leaving the city by the eastern gate, and passing a small village or two, you ascend the hill to the plateau, and before you, as far as the eye can reach, stretches the great Arabian desert. With mingling fear and wonder at the mystery always lying beyond the desert horizon, you tap gently with your heel upon the shoulder of the dromedary to urge her on. At first, paying little heed to you, she hesitates and glances anxiously about the desert, as if in search of an enemy. Now and then she reaches down to graze the thorny argool along the way. As the taps upon her shoulder are repeated, she stretches out her long neck, and with long strides makes for the eastern horizon. She realizes that she is bound on the long journey across the desert. Hour after hour she bears you over the hard, monotonous plain. The Damascus mosques and their minarets sink beneath the western sky. The desert about you shows no signs of life, only a tall column of whirling sand, rearing its head until it is lost in the blue above, moves majestically along. In the distance your eyes detect a beautiful lake, with shores fringed with trees. But soon the phantom lake vanishes, while others, still farther beyond, appear and vanish in rapid succession. Like a great ball of fire, the sun sinks in the west. The stars come out one by one and shine brighter than elsewhere, as if to light you on your way. Late at night, the weary dromedary kneels, and on the ground close beside her you lie down to sleep. Again, long before the stars have been scattered by the morning sun, you are on your way. Day after day you travel on, scorched by the heat of noonday, shivering in the chill winds of the night. 2 weeks pass, and at last you stand on the eastern edge of the plateau, gazing down upon the great Euphrates winding along the valley beneath. You have crossed the Arabian desert, the first stage of the long journey to the walls of Babylon. Here, in the valley, the water is sweet and the food abundant. For 10 days you follow down the river, through little villages and black tent encampments, among scenes of strange Arab life which never lose their charm. Everywhere the valley is dotted with the mounds of buried cities carefully guarding the secrets of the centuries of long ago. At last you see before you a mound rising like a mountain from the level plain. Your journey is at an end. Before you is Babylon, the gate of God, as the old name means. About you is all that remains of the second of the 7 wonders of the world. Babylon, even in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, was an old, old city. There is a Hebrew tradition that it was the oldest of all cities, but now we know that great empires flourished and passed away before Babylon was built. Old King Sargon I, who may have lived as early as 3800 BC, seems to have been the first to mention Babylon, and one of his inscriptions seems to say that he built the city and gave it its name. But in those very early days, Babylon was little more than a shrine, surrounded with mud huts and date palms. It was about 2250 BC, when the great Hammurabi made it his capital, that it became the chief city of Babylonia. Its history for the next 1500 years or more is obscure. We know the names of its kings, and the records speak of long wars with the Assyrians. In the year 689 BC, Sennacherib, king of Nineveh, captured Babylon, tore down its palaces and temples and walls, and scraped even the foundations of the city into the river. The place where the old city had stood for 3,000 years again became a desert. Esarhaddon, the son of Sennacherib, was the next king of Nineveh. He rebuilt Babylon that, in accordance with the ancient custom, he might be crowned in the sacred city. When Esarhaddon died, one of his sons, Samas-Sumyukin, was made king of Babylon. Another son, Assurbanipal, or the great Sardanapalus of the Greeks, became the king of Nineveh. War broke out between the two brothers, and again Babylon was captured. In 626 Assurbanipal died, and in that same year Nabopolassar, the father of the great Nebuchadnezzar, became the king of Babylon. The building of the Babylon so famous in history began with Nabopolassar. He enlarged the old city, erected temples, and began the construction of its walls. In 606, Nineveh, the old enemy of Babylon, fell, never to rise again. The next year, in 605, Nabopolassar died, and Nebuchadnezzar succeeded him to the throne. He continued the building operations of his father until Babylon became the greatest city of its age, and surrounded it with walls the like of which no other city has ever seen. Nebuchadnezzar, or Nebuchadrezzar, as his name should be spelled, was the greatest character in Babylonian history. But about his name so many legends have grown that it is sometimes difficult to learn the facts of his life. Early, he married Amuhia, a daughter of the Median king. His military career began while he was still the crown prince, and his father was on the throne. In 605, at the head of the Babylonian army, he defeated the Egyptians in the famous battle of Carchemish, the old Hittite capital, and drove them from Asia. Then Syria and Palestine were added to his future empire. In 597, when he sent his army to Jerusalem, he won the hatred of the Jews by taking Jehoiakin, the king, captive. 11 years later, in 586, he destroyed the sacred Hebrew city, transported the Jews to Babylon, and brought the Hebrew kingdom to an end. Centuries afterward, even to this day, Jewish mothers teach their children to hate his name. They tell how he forced the exiles to carry heavy bags of sand across the desert to increase their burdens, how he cast Hebrew lads into a fiery furnace and into the lion's den, and how, in punishment for all his wickedness, he became a calf, and for 7 years grazed the grass in the fields about the city. Late in his life, in 567, he invaded Egypt. During all his reign there was little peace in his great, mixed, turbulent empire. The walls of the palaces of many of the Assyrian kings were lined with great stone slabs, engraved with reliefs, and sometimes with the portrait of a king. But in Babylonia, stone was difficult to obtain, and sculptures were very rare. Therefore, it was useless to hope that Nebuchadnezzar's portrait would be found on his palace walls. However, several decades ago, an Oriental appeared at the Berlin Museum, offering for sale a small cameo engraved with a helmeted head of a Greek type. About the head was an inscription in Greek characters saying that the face was that of Nebuchadnezzar. The museum authorities believed that the cameo was one of the many spurious objects which the Eastern forgers were constantly sending to Europe, yet they took an impression of it and returned it to its owner. Years later, when the archaeologists could readily distinguish the false from the true, it was recognized that the cameo was genuine, and that it bore the likeness of the great king. Unfortunately, the little stone seal, perhaps the only one to preserve for us his features, appears to have been lost forever. Its impression shows the face of a beardless young man, intelligent and refined. The eyes are suggestive of the Semitic, the nose is of the Greek type, the lips are thin, the chin prominent, the neck is that of a strong, vigorous man. Such was the appearance of the builder of the walls of Babylon. Religion and cruelty frequently go hand in hand, And Nebuchadnezzar was exceedingly religious. Though a great warrior, it was not for his military deeds that he was best known. He was fond of restoring the ruined temples of the old Babylonian cities, and most of the records which have come from his time speak chiefly of his deeds of piety. Read the introduction to any of his inscriptions, of which the following is one, and you will call him vain and proud, but his scribe wrote it in the manner customary for the scribes of those days to write of their royal masters. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the exalted prince, the favorite of Marduk, the lofty Patesi, the beloved of Nabu, the arbiter, the possessor of wisdom, who seeks out the path of their divinity, who reverences their lordship, the untiring governor, who ponders daily concerning the maintenance of Esagil and Ezida, and is continually anxious for the shrines of Babylon and Borsippa, the wise, the pious, the maintainer of Esagil and Ezida, the firstborn son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, am I. However cruel and religiously intolerant Nebuchadnezzar may have been, he was undoubtedly the greatest builder the world has ever seen. There is scarcely one of the thousands of ruined mounds in Babylonia which does not contain bricks bearing his name. There is scarcely a royal record from his reign which is not chiefly occupied with the descriptions of his building operations. He rebuilt scores of the ancient temples, surrounded many cities with walls, lined the shores of the rivers with embankments, and spanned the rivers with bridges. Tradition says that to please his foreign wife from the mountainous country, he built the famous Hanging Gardens, but that may be only a tradition. His palace in Babylon was one of the world's largest buildings, but the walls with which he protected his palace and city were the wonder of the whole world. The ancients never tired of describing them. Fortunately, in several of his long inscriptions recently discovered in the Babylonian mounds, Nebuchadnezzar speaks of the building of the walls. In one of them he says, "I completed Imgur Bel and Nimiti Bel, the great walls of Babylon, the mighty city, the city of his exalted power. At the entrance of the great gates I erected strong bulls of bronze and terrible serpents standing upright. My father did that which no previous king had done. With mortar and bricks he built 2 moat walls about the city, and I, with mortar and bricks, built a 3rd great moat wall, and joined it and united it closely with the moat walls of my father. I laid its foundation deep to the water level. I raised its summit mountain high. I constructed a moat wall of burned bricks about the west wall of Babylon. My father built the moat wall of the Araktu Canal securely with mortar and bricks. He built well the quays along the opposite shore of the Euphrates, but he did not finish all his work. But I, his firstborn, the beloved of his heart, built the moat walls of Araktu with mortar and bricks, and, joining them together with those of my father, made them very solid, a thing which no king before had ever done. To the west of Babylon, at a greater distance from the outer wall, I constructed an enclosing wall 4,000 cubits in length about the city. I dug its moat to the water level. I walled up its side with mortar and burned bricks, and I united it securely with the moat walls of my father. Along its edge I built a great wall of mortar and burned bricks mountain high." Berosus, a priest of the temple of Bel at Babylon, writing about 250 B.C., was living in the city while the walls were still standing, though in a ruinous condition. His brief description of them should not be omitted. He says that Nebuchadnezzar built 3 walls round about the inner city, and 3 others about that which was the outer, and this he did with burnt brick. And after he had walled the city and adorned its gates, he built another palace before his father's palace, but so that they joined to it. to describe whose vast height and immense riches it would perhaps be too much for me to attempt. Yet, as large and lofty as they were completed in 15 days. He also erected elevated places for walking of stone, and made it resemble mountains, and built it so that it might be planted with all sorts of trees. He also erected what is called a pensile paradise, because his wife was desirous to have things like her own country, she having been bred up in the palaces of Medea. Of all the ancient descriptions of the famous walls and the city they protected, that of Herodotus is the fullest. Perhaps Herodotus had never been in Babylon. Perhaps the tales that travelers told him were exaggerated, as travelers' tales are likely to be. Yet he at least tried to be accurate. He says, "The city stands on a broad plain, and is an exact square, 120 furlongs in length each way, so that the entire circuit is 480 furlongs. While such is its size, in magnificence there is no other city that approaches to it. It is surrounded, in the first place, by a broad and deep moat, full of water, behind which rises a wall, 50 royal cubits in width and 200 in height. And here I may not omit to tell the use to which the mould dug out of the great moat was turned, nor the manner wherein the wall was wrought. As fast as they dug the moat, the soil which they got from the cutting was made into bricks, and when a sufficient number were completed, they baked the bricks in kilns. Then they set to building, and began by bricking the borders of the moat, after which they proceeded to construct the wall itself, using throughout for their cement hot bitumen, and interposing a layer of wattled reeds at every 30th course of the bricks. On the top, along the edges of the wall, they constructed buildings of a single chamber facing one another, leaving between them room for a 4-horse chariot to turn. In the circuit of the wall are 100 gates, all of brass, with brazen lintels and side-posts. The bitumen used in the work was brought to Babylon from Is, a small stream which flows into the Euphrates at the point where the city of the same name stands, 8 days' journey from Babylon. Lumps of bitumen are found in great abundance in this river. The city is divided into 2 portions by the river which runs through the midst of it. This river is the Euphrates, a broad, deep, swift stream which rises in Armenia and empties itself into the Erythraean Sea. The city wall is brought down on both sides to the edge of the stream. Thence from the corners of the wall there is carried along each bank of the river a fence of burnt bricks. The houses are mostly 3 and 4 stories high. The streets all run in straight lines, not only those parallel to the river, but also the cross streets which lead down to the water side. At the river end of these cross streets are low gates in the fence that skirts the stream, which are, like the great gates in the outer wall, of brass and open on the water. The outer wall is the main defense of the city. There is, however, a second inner wall of less thickness than the first, but very little inferior to it in strength. The center of each division of the town is occupied by a fortress. In the one stood the palace of the kings, surrounded by a wall of great strength and size. In the other was the sacred precinct of Jupiter Belus, a square enclosure 2 furlongs each way, with gates of solid brass, which was also remaining in my time. In the middle of the precinct there was a tower of solid masonry, a furlong in length and breadth, upon which was raised a second tower, and on that a third, and so on up to 8. The ascent to the top is on the outside, by a path which winds round all the towers. When one is about halfway up, one finds a resting place and seats where persons are wont to sit sometimes on their way to the summit. Other ancient descriptions of the walls have been left us by Ctesias of the 5th century B.C. and by Strabo of the beginning of the Christian era, but they add little to our knowledge. Should we compare these ancient descriptions of the walls, we should find them hopelessly conflicting. However, they teach us that, in those early days when most cities were surrounded by enormous walls, the walls of Babylon were so long and wide and high that all who saw them were amazed. It is only from their ruins that we may hope to obtain accurate information of the strongest fortifications in the ancient world. In the year 562, after a long reign of 43 years, Nebuchadnezzar died. He was followed by three kings whose reigns were short, and in 555 Nabonidus, the father of the biblical Belshazzar, came to the throne. Cyrus, the king of Persia, was rising to power, and after he had defeated the Medes, he extended his empire to the Mediterranean and even to Egypt. Perhaps Babylon was so strongly fortified that at first he made no attempt to add it to his empire. But when Nabonidus joined with the king of Egypt and with the wealthy Croesus of Lydia in an alliance against him, Cyrus decided that Babylon must be taken. In 538 the city fell, and for a time it became the home of the Persian king. The fall of Babylon with its lofty walls was a most important event in the history of the ancient world. A great empire which had existed for more than 3,000 years was brought to an end. The old enemies of Babylon rejoiced. When the news came to the Hebrews, who were held there in exile, they excitedly rushed about the streets, crying, "Babylon is fallen!" And to them came hope of returning to Jerusalem. But how did the mighty city fall? How could Cyrus take Babylon, whose walls were strong enough to resist any army? It is a long story. Poets have sung it, historians have written it, prophets have preached it, legends have gathered about it. Every child knows the story of the writing of the hand on the wall. It was the night that Babylon fell. Belshazzar the king, he was really the king's son, gave a feast to 1,000 of his nobles. In the great banquet hall of the palace, when the guests were drinking from the golden cups and the revelry was at its highest, there suddenly appeared upon the wall an armless hand. High up, where all might see it, the armless hand wrote the king's fate. "Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting." In that night, so the story ends, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. Less picturesque than this Hebrew legend is the royal record of Babylon, which fortunately was inscribed upon a clay cylinder from the ruins of the city. It refers to the death of the king's son, possibly to Belshazzar of the Bible story. In the month Tammuz, when Cyrus fought the troops of Akkad, Babylonia, at Opis on the river Salsallat, he subdued the people, and wherever they collected he slew them. On the 14th day, Sippar was taken without a battle. Nabonidus fled. On the 16th day the troops of Cyrus entered Babylon without a battle. Nabonidus was taken prisoner in Babylon. On the 3rd of Marchesvan, Cyrus entered Babylon and proclaimed peace to all the city. He appointed Gobryas governor of Babylon. On the night of the 11th day, Gobryas killed the son of the king. Nor does the royal record of Babylon contain the only contemporary account of the fall of the city, for upon a barrel-shaped cylinder of clay bearing a long inscription, we have Cyrus's account of his capture of Babylon. Extracts from it are as follows: Marduk, the great lord, looking with joy on his pious works and upright heart, commanded him, Cyrus, to go forth to his city Babylon, and he went by his side as a friend and companion. His many troops, whose number, like the waters of the river, could not be counted, marched in full armor at his side. Without a skirmish or a battle, he permitted them to enter Babylon, and, sparing the city, he delivered the king Nabonidus to him. All the people of Babylon prostrated themselves before him, and, kissing his feet, rejoiced in his sovereignty, while happiness shone on their faces. The inscription continues. I am Cyrus, king of the world. When I made my gracious entry into Babylon, with exceeding joy I took up my abode in the royal palace. My many troops marched peacefully into Babylon. I gave heed to the needs of Babylon and its cities, and the servitude of the Babylonians. Whatever was oppressive, I removed from them. I quieted their sighings and soothed their sorrows. A much longer account of the capture of Babylon by Cyrus appears in the writings of Herodotus. Though Herodotus wrote nearly 100 years after Babylon fell, his story seems to bear the stamp of truth. He certainly mentions details which neither Nabonidus nor Cyrus would care to have appear in their royal records. His story is as follows. Cyrus, with the first approach of the ensuing spring, marched forward against Babylon. The Babylonians, encamped without their walls, awaited his coming. A battle was fought at a short distance from the city, in which the Babylonians were defeated by the Persian king, whereupon they withdrew within their defences. Here they shut themselves up and made light of his siege, having laid in a store of provision for many years in preparation against this attack. For when they saw Cyrus conquering nation after nation, they were convinced that he would never stop, and their turn would come at last. Cyrus was now reduced to great perplexity, as time went on and he made no progress against the place. In this distress, either someone made this suggestion to him, or he bethought himself of a plan which he proceeded to put in execution. He placed a portion of his army at the point where the river enters the city, and another body at the back of the place where it issues forth, with orders to march into the town by the bed of the stream, as soon as the water became shallow enough. He then himself drew off with the unwarlike portion of his host, and made for the place where Nitocris dug the basin for the river, where he did exactly what she had done formerly. He turned the Euphrates by a canal into the basin, which was then a marsh, on which the river sank to such an extent that the natural bed of the stream became fordable. Hereupon the Persians, who had been left for the purpose at Babylon by the riverside, entered the stream, which had now sunk so as to reach about midway up a man's thigh, and thus got into the town.